All right. Hello, everybody. We are here for the second episode of Palantir Deep Dives. I just realized I had scheduled the stream for 10:15 p.m. instead of 8:15 p.m., which it was supposed to be. So a lot of you are probably did not find it at the time you're supposed to find it. But nonetheless, we are here. And that's why it's good that it's a stream. So if you guys want to watch it afterwards, you have a chance to be able to watch it afterwards. We're going to be talking about a bunch of different things. Well, not a bunch of different things, a bunch of different components of this overall idea that I want to discuss here, which is around the secret reason Peter Thiel started Palantir. Now, again, if you're new to Deep Dives, the whole concept of Deep Dives is basically taking one topic around Palantir and going super deep on it for about 30 minutes. So not really like the Palantir daily episodes that I do on the channel, nothing to do with the stock, nothing to do with, like the day-to-day news, just more so taking a concept, going deep, trying to understand it at a broader level, and then trying to kind of figure out what we can learn as, I guess, Palantir nerds around that topic to get a better understanding of the company. So today, I really wanted to talk about two separate clips that I have that are going to encompass a larger, broader argument around why Peter Thiel started Palantir. And I think a lot of people have forgotten or just have never heard of these reasons. They obviously think of Palantir in a variety of different ways. And some people even forget that Peter Thiel is still involved with Palantir. But the company was founded in 2003 for a particular reason. And the nature of why that company was founded, although it gets, I guess, manipulated by how the media construes the point of the company, actually has to deal with civil liberties. And that's going to be the core premise of what we're going to be talking about today. Kelly, thank you for being in the chat. You are the first person here. Patrick Hoyle, Midwest. Matt Blake, how's it going? Thank you for being here, sir. Thank you, everybody, for being here. All right. So on episode 2 of Deep Dives, we are going to get into the secret reason that Peter Thiel started Palantir. Now, before we get into this, let's discuss Peter Thiel for a little bit first, and then we're going to get into kind of the core things I wanted to talk about around Palantir. So Peter Thiel, who is Peter Thiel? Peter Thiel is one of the most successful venture capitalists and entrepreneurs of our lifetime. Started PayPal, sold it to eBay, $1.5 billion exit, invested $500,000 into Facebook when it was worth a couple $1 million. That investment, like 3,000x or something like that. I think he made like $7-8 billion off of that. He got a lot of shares, sold a lot of his shares at the IPO, still has some of his shares in his Roth IRA. I mean, Peter Thiel is just a legendary investor. Peter Thiel is one of the most controversial figures in the Valley, primarily because, people don't really like him for a variety of reasons. He's really against the kind of DEI initiatives, the woke movements of Silicon Valley, the nature of diversity, inclusion, things of this stuff. He's always been someone that's more on the sides of meritocracy. In fact, he wrote a book back when he was in Stanford called The Diversity Myth. And this entire book was premised off the idea that essentially diversity is not something that we should focus on. And it's a little bit more of a communist concept, and rather we should focus on free markets, libertarianism, and ultimately meritocracy. Peter Thiel is also someone who uniquely believes in the concept of Ayn Rand. And Ayn Rand, I'm going to do a separate episode one day over the course of the year talking about Ayn Rand's philosophy in the context of Peter Thiel. But it really has to do with this radical notion of being selfish and this concept of self-rationalism. And the idea is if you can do what's in your best interest as an individual for yourself, you have a broader opportunity to help everyone else in the world if you can focus on yourself first. And there's a lot of different components into it. But Peter Thiel is a libertarian by nature. He does not like the government. He is very pro-Bitcoin because it essentially represents an anarchic and it represents anarchy, and it represents a form of currency that is not withholden by the powers that may be, particularly centralized powers. And so at the end of the day, that's where Peter Thiel stands for. Now, having said that, why am I bringing that up? Well, the reason that I'm bringing that up is because Peter Thiel doesn't really like the government, and he doesn't like when the government has control over people. Now, this is a little bit paradoxical because the entire company of Palantir was founded and funded and ultimately seed invested from In-Q-Tel, which is the CIA's venture capital fund, and it is the government at the end of the day. So you got someone who is, he just does not like the government. He would rather live his life where the government doesn't tell him what to do. Sort of a true libertarian at its core. One could already argue a radical, extreme libertarian. And then you've got Palantir, which is a government-focused company. I mean, they're going to make $1.3 billion off the government this year, probably $1.4 billion. A lot of money coming from the government for a company that doesn't necessarily like the government, and for a company that's entire purpose in the beginning was to serve the government. Why is that the case? And that's what I wanted to deep dive on. How do we resolve this paradox of someone who is so anti-government and pro-freedom and liberty building a company whose main purpose is to serve the government, and what the critics argue essentially means to help the government surveil you as an individual citizen, because the nature of how that company operates and the contracts that they perform for the government, the technology they give, allows the government to do more bad things to different people. So here's what Peter Thiel has to say in his own words. Let's listen to a little bit of this, because I think he points out a couple of key important points, and then we'll analyze what he has to say.
This is clearly going to be a theme to almost everything else we talk about. So let's sort of catch up to where you are today, and then we're going to go back to some of that stuff. Tell me a little bit about Palantir.
Well, this was another company I started in 2004. It was sort of the big picture of PayPal was sort of to revolutionize money and payments. The big picture for Palantir, sort of like in the wake of 9/11, a few years after that, was could one do something from a libertarian or civil liberties point of view that would still be, tough on terrorism and things like this. And the sort of sense I had was that the way we were going with just ridiculous airport security checks and super intrusive surveillance all the time, wasn't really making us safer.
Yeah.
And
so this was sort of your answer to the Patriot Act in a way.
In a way, this was sort of, it was like you had the ridiculous lines at airports. You'd been through all the ways that the response to, and there was a question: was there some technological fix? And one of the ways I often think of technology is that it's a way to do more with less, and so you can get more energy for less money. That's like an energy innovation, or cleaner energy for less pollution, more energy that pollutes less. That would be like a technology innovation in clean energy. And in the security space, the doing more with less is something like more security with less intrusion on people's civil liberties. And that's kind of the trade-off that you want. And that the non-technological debate that we had in the U.S. in 2004, in many ways that we still have in 2018, is always you do more with more versus less with less.
Right.
And so you can have the neocon Cheney version, let's say, would be that we're going to have more security with more civil liberties violations, and then you can sort of say that the equally Luddite ACLU would say something like, we're going to have fewer civil liberties violations, and we're going to have less security.
Right.
And that's kind of the way the ideological debate gets framed. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm sympathetic to the ACLU on civil liberties, but I think they will always lose that debate, because the way you preserve civil liberties is not to have terrorist attacks. Because when you get a terrorist attack, you get the Patriot Act. And if the World Trade Center would erode civil liberties as much as it did in 2001, I didn't even want to think what would happen if you had another terrorist attack. And so,
all right. So what he said right there is absolute gold. And I think a lot of people either haven't heard the argument or don't really understand the argument. So I want to break that down and go really deep into that concept. So for those that are just joining, Peter Thiel, we just watched a clip of him explaining Palantir back in 2018, this interview was. And I'll just put the full link in the description, or I'll put it in the chat if anyone wants to watch it. They have a timestamp with Palantir, so you can see the full thing. Now, why did he say that he is sympathetic to what the ACLU is arguing for in regards to the protection of civil liberties, but he believes that they're ultimately incorrect in terms of how they understand how civil liberties operate and the way that they're essentially framing the argument? Peter Thiel's argument is that we created Palantir after 9/11. And a lot of people think, okay, so you created Palantir to help the government surveil people, right? And that's the problem with Palantir, is that it's this surveillance arm of the government and it's doing all these evil things, blah, 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 blah. Thiel's argument right there is fundamentally more philosophical and deeper, and it gave me a broader appreciation for not only why I want to invest in Palantir, but why I think Palantir has a moat in regards to the technology that they create. Peter's argument is actually the reason we created Palantir was not to help the government surveil and intrude on your civil liberties. The reason we created Palantir is to protect from the government protruding and surveilling on your civil liberties. Now, that's a sort of contrarian take, and that's the nature of Peter Thiel. He's very contrarian, and if you're right and contrarian, you end up winning big time, especially in the world of investing. You've got to be early, you've got to be right, and you've got to be willing to be different. So what is his argument? His argument is, if a terrorist attack happens, for example, 9/11, the outset after 9/11 in 2006, about 5 years later from those terrorist attacks, was the Patriot Act. What was the Patriot Act? It was essentially gave the United States government unfiltered freedom to surveil people that they felt could do bad things in certain areas in the name of stopping certain terrorist attacks from happening again in the future. So it's like, look, these people took down the Twin Towers. That created, a massive amount of stress and just economic hardship, and obviously a lot of death all throughout the United States. It led us to go to war, yada, yada, yada. All these bad things happened because of this one event. If we had just, checked you a little bit more in the airport, if we had patted you down a little bit more, if we had, tapped a little bit of different voices, and we could tell that maybe you're talking to try to plan some terrorist attack, and we listened in on your phone calls, if we had just done a little bit more of that, we would have been able to come to the conclusion that this terrorist attack is happening, and we could have stopped it. And so Thiel's argument is that the reason we needed to stop Palantir is because if you have a government that says we are going to protect your civil liberties in the name of safety, and that is the rational justification that they use to ultimately allow that safety to be protected, you're going to get things like the Patriot Act. You're going to get things like a government that is fundamentally overreaching, as Matt says in the chat, Edward Snowden, yes, someone who has unveiled a lot of the things the government has done when it comes to surveillance and the NSA and things of that nature. So this is where the argument becomes fundamentally philosophical, because now you have to pick two worlds. Do you want one world in which bad things happen, like a terrorist attack, which are to an extent inevitable, right? Because we know people are going to do bad things, and it's impossible to stop everyone from doing bad things. Bad things are going to happen. When those bad things happen, do you want the government, which is bureaucratic, which is not necessarily the most technologically advanced, which is filled with ideological people that really can't agree with each other. So you just got a bunch of hodgepodge in one place, and we call it the government. Do you want them trying to resolve some of the problems that have happened as a result of a terrorist attack? Because when they do decide they're going to be the ones to solve it, it's likely always going to be enforcing and encroaching on people's civil liberties, because honestly, that's what the government has to do. And most governments are not truly libertarian. Most governments, you see what's happening in Argentina. We got all these different places that are trying to become a little bit more libertarian, but at the end of the day, a lot of these governments are becoming more intrusive on civil liberties and rights. And you do this through excessive taxation. You do this through forcing people to wear certain things. This is just how the government operates, especially when you give a lot of people a lot of power, they end up becoming corrupt. So that's one world you can live in. The other world you can live in, which is what Thiel which Thiel is preaching, is the world in which a technology company can build technology to stop the attacks from happening, in this case, terrorist attacks, in order to not let the government have a rational justification to be able to say, we need to stop, we need to intrude on your civil liberties. So, and that's where Palantir comes in, right? Because Palantir can create the technology, and particularly the technology that has a heavy focus around civil liberties. Well, now you've got a technology that is focused on civil liberties, has the technological wherewithal to be able to do the things that it needs to do in order to stop bad things from happening. And this goes to the argument that Peter Thiel has made and Alex Karp has made around stopping terrorist attacks in Europe, particularly far right-wing actors that were engaging in were engaging in the potential of terrorist attacks. Since 2014, Palantir has thwarted many of these different terrorist attacks, and that has led Europe to being less intrusive on their citizens. Because if you have a terrorist attack in Germany and France and Sweden and all these different places, well, those governments that are already not libertarian, definitely not libertarian, a little bit more socialized than most governments would be, definitely more than the West, they would have further excuses to encroach on people's liberties in the name of safety. And from the government's perspective, you can't really blame them, because their argument is like, well, the only way for us to stop these things from happening again is to make sure we massively surveil and make sure people don't bring, horrible things on an airplane or do bad things in public. But from a citizen's perspective, it's like, I get that, but that doesn't mean that I'm the 0.0001% of people that's going to launch some terrorist attack just because you think I'm that person or you think I look like that person. So Peter Thiel's argument, again, someone who's a staunch libertarian, is making the broader argument that instead of allowing the government to have the justification, which they always will use if something bad happens, to encroach on your civil liberties, because that's the nature and purpose of what a bureaucratic government does, especially when you consolidate all that power in one place and really centralize all that power. Why don't we have a technology company that could stop those attacks from happening in the first place, in order to not give the government that excuse? Now, that begs the question, well, does that mean that the company that's building that power, does that mean that the company that's building that technology to stop those attacks from happening, does that company have the capacity to also not violate people's civil liberties? And I think that's where the crux of the debate gets into, is Palantir actually violating your civil liberties or not? And, the mainstream media has painted Palantir in a certain way. Obviously, a lot of different events have happened over the past 5-10 years. The NHS deal was a prime example of us winning the contract, but having to go through hell just to be able to win the contract, because a lot of people assumed that Palantir's goal was to steal and monetize data, when in reality, their goal was necessarily not to be able to do that. Luke Francis says, Peter Thiel just like Lord of the Rings. That's another reason why he likes Palantir. He's like Lord of the Rings. But the point I'm trying to make here is that it's such an interesting philosophical argument, because it's like, if you really break it down, it makes a lot of sense. If you want to stop the government from being intrusive, you have to make sure bad things don't happen to give the government the excuse to be intrusive. The only way you stop bad things from happening is two ways. Either you agree that everyone is altruistic and people just won't do bad things. That's not that easy, right? Because people are not the nicest people in the world. We saw what just happened in Israel. People will do bad things. We have too many conflicting ideological viewpoints in the world, where one group thinks the other group is wrong, and that's going to result in violence in order to do the things that they want to do. That was the basis for 9/11, right? Death to America. And that's what we ultimately saw from the people that attacked us. Or you have a technology company that just stops it. So you either allow the arbitrary affective nature of how people will just be altruistic and bad things won't happen, or you use technology to stop those bad things from happening, which means there is a degree of surveillance within that technology, but that technology is built to protect people's civil liberties so that there is not a massive amount of surveillance like the government could impose on other people as well. Here's another clip that I want to point to of Peter Thiel talking about the same concept. We just listened to him talk about it on the Dave Rubin podcast. Here's another one talking with Ryan Holiday about why Palantir is important when it comes to privacy.
Tension then with, two of the companies you're most publicly associated with have both privacy issues, but then are inherently about taking data, which would maybe otherwise be private, and using it to some public end.
Well,
I'm talking about Facebook and Palantir.
Yeah,
here.
so I have to always be careful, what I say in these things. So there's a on the Facebook side, this certainly is one of the things that's controversial about the company, and we need to, and there is sort of this question about where the right balance gets struck. Now, in the case of Facebook, it is the users themselves that put all the information out there, and maybe they don't know what they're doing, or there's something wrong with it, but it is voluntary. So I do think there's a very big difference between things that are voluntary versus things that are not. I think that in the case of Palantir, which is sort of a national security context, so you're trying to identify terrorists, and so what kind of stuff can we know about people to identify terrorists? And you have all kinds of protections on that. And the way I would position Palantir as a pro-privacy company is that the high-tech solution is that you find very targeted ways to get information about people. The low-tech solution is you get all the information about everybody. So if you don't have any technology, you end up with a sort of a sweeping low-tech solution. Think about like sort of the low-tech airport security systems we have, which are sort of very intrusive. And the goal was to actually have something that is higher tech and less intrusive. One way I've often thought of defining technology means doing more with less. And so in the context of a national security company like Palantir, it means more security with fewer privacy violations as a trade-off. And then the non-technological debate we have in our society is between people who are concerned about security, which is like less privacy with more privacy violations, with more security, or sort of maybe the ACLU, where you have more privacy and fewer things, but they sort of go together versus go differently.
Yeah, no, I'm interested not necessarily just in some of the controversies about those two companies, but just the idea of if privacy is so important to why do we willingly give up so much of our privacy?
Well, I think I would just say there's a very sharp distinction between us giving it up versus it being taken away from people. And I think in cases where it gets taken away, that's where we should draw a bright line around that.
Got it. That makes sense. Well, let's go back to the discussion. So
Okay, cool. So now, what is the point he was trying to make there? Again, the broader point Thiel was trying to make here is the difference between Facebook and Palantir. Now, obviously, Facebook incredibly controversial. You know what's really interesting as well about the Palantir investing community? I've noticed that a lot of people that invest in Palantir, they hate Meta. They hate investing in Meta. You can put in the chat if you're one of those people. That's totally fine. I, quite frankly, I don't care. I mean, I think Meta is a company that allows people to advertise their products and services, and they make a shit ton of money off advertising dollars. It's not that big of a deal to me. But ideologically, I understand why a lot of people are opposed to Meta, even though I really don't, because if you're on YouTube, Twitter, if you're on any social media, you're supporting the same idea as what Meta is supporting. In my opinion, I don't think Meta is so uniquely different than a lot of the other social media companies that exist. Nonetheless, and it's ironic because the Palantir investors hate Meta, and the guy who created Palantir literally gave the seed investment to Meta. Like that's actually a tweet. I should tweet that out one day. Like a lot of Palantir investors despise Meta, and the guy who made Palantir also was the reason why Meta, became a thing. Why Facebook even became. It's just ironic to even think about that. But the nature of the difference between Facebook and Meta and Palantir is that Facebook wants to hoard user data, and from that data, be able to monetize it via attention. So via advertising. So really the capturing of attention is kind of the core thesis for Meta. And, the whole idea of the metaverse, all of this stuff is how can we capture attention in such a sophisticated way that then we're able to monetize that attention at scale, and do what we need to do. The core thesis with Palantir has nothing to do with the monetization of attention. The thesis around Palantir is what if we actually are able to enable a government, because we're talking about it from a civil liberties perspective. And this also, deals with the companies as well in terms of data, privacy, regulation, all that stuff. And we'll get into that in separate episodes. But from a government perspective, it has nothing to do with monetization of attention. It has to do with how can we focus the government's attention in the right places? How do we make sure we become an operating system for the government so that when the government is trying to ultimately do something that is imposing on people's civil liberties, there are checks and balances built into the very nature of the technology so that the government doesn't have to do it in a bad way. And how do we do this in a way that also protects people's civil liberties if the government wants to do something that is potentially intrusive? This is from their website right here. I just want to read a little bit from here. They say Palantir is dedicated to working for the common good and doing what's right, in addition to being deeply passionate about building great software and a successful company. Palantir was founded on the conviction that it's essential to preserve fundamental principles of privacy and civil liberties while using data. Our earliest work in counterterrorism required us to ask whether we could meaningfully strengthen national security in the US without weakening constitutional privacy protections. That sentence is very, very important. I do not believe that Palantir would be around as a public company today if they were able to strengthen national security in the United States, which means aid and assistance in assisting the government to stop bad things from happening. If they also at the same time weakened constitutional privacy protections. I don't think it would have been a thing. They needed to be able to do both at the same time, and their ability to manage both, quite frankly, is what I believe has led to them being able to get the trust of all these other Western NATO countries that want to be able to use Palantir. In response, we invested financial and intellectual capital to build technology that is now trusted by the world's most stringent and skeptical data protection regimes, aka the NHS. Our culture of open and critical discussion around the implications of our technology ensures that we remain true to that initial conviction, even as the nature of data and the environments where we operate evolve. They obviously have a lot of different principles that understand how they think about civil liberties principles. Focus is rooted in AI. Rails, authentication, all that stuff. Decisions that can affect individual rights to freedom, opportunity, and happiness cannot be left solely to computers, and technology is not the answer to every single problem. So the reason I wanted to sort of bring this into a broader sphere and do a deep dive on this is because I think the secret reason that Peter Thiel started Palantir was because he saw the government becoming incredibly intrusive in people's lives after 9/11. And because he saw the government becoming incredibly intrusive in people's lives after 9/11, the question was, how do we stop that from happening? And in PayPal, which they ended up selling for $1.5 billion, they were able to do this to an extent. They were able to stop fraud in the financial space via algorithmic tracking of pattern recognition that allowed them to come up with some really amazing proprietary software. And it ended up being the gateway for how people pay for things on the internet. And that ended up being PayPal. And they sold it right before the tech bubble in 2001. So, or at the top of 2000. Tech bubble was in 2001 or 2000. I think, no, it was at the top of 2000, I believe. That's when it happened. And so from that perspective, it was like, all right, if we take that technology, take all those ideas and thoughts that we learn, and then we bring it to the government space for anti-terrorism and for helping the government to stop bad things from happening like 9/11, I honestly think it was Peter Thiel's legacy at the end of the day. Right. It was his, because he's a staunch libertarian, and we'll talk in the future of, how he thinks about Iran and self-rationalism and things of that nature. But I think he saw the government going down a very dark path in the name of protecting civil liberties. And the premise was, well, why don't we not let that happen? And if we need to start a whole company and go on a whole movement to be able to create software that the government could actually use in a meaningful way, then maybe that's a better approach to be able to do it. Not a secret. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely not a secret. This is more so the thing that the average Palantir investor, I think, doesn't really know why Palantir was created after 9/11 and what the whole civil liberties argument kind of entailed. And so that's why I wanted to do a broader deep dive today on the show, discussing that a little bit more in depth. So yeah, that's what I want to discuss. And if you guys have any more topics for Palantir deep dives, let me know in the comments. Let me know in the chat anything you guys are thinking of. But I think this is one of the things to remember, because the final thing I'll say on this is the implication of this is the NHS deal. The implication of this is Germany giving us $100 million one day. The implication of this is being able to become the operating system for a Taiwan or a Japan or a South Korea. Like, the implication of doing what we were able to do after 9/11 in the context of Palantir and building the trust that they've built, the credibility, and then most importantly, the technology built with those principles of civil liberties protection. That is what every government in the world is going to require in this geopolitical landscape. And if we're able to execute against that thesis, I think that's just going to be a lot more growth for Palantir in the long term. All right. That's it for me. Episode 2, Palantir deep dives in the book. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Fun one for me. We'll be talking about some more stuff tomorrow. This deep dive series, we'll be talking about philosophy stuff. It'll be talking about technical stuff. It'll be talking about AI stuff. There's a ton of stuff. I mean, we're going to talk about how AIP actually works. I mean, I've been experimenting with LLMs. We're going to talk about vector databases, RAG, all this different stuff that is in the technical components of it. So there's a lot of things we have to do on these series over the following months. All right, that's it for me. Have a good one, everybody. I'll be live on Finance Junkies on that channel at 9 p.m. So in about 15 minutes. So if you want to get a little bit more of me and the guys, then I'll see you guys there on Finance Junkies. Have a good one, everybody. Good night. Bye-bye.